Well, it looks like it's that time. Hopefully you guys can hear me okay. My first Twitch stream. Who knows how well it's going to go. Looks like there's at least one of you here, which is really nice for me. I'm going to tilt that a little bit so you can see my whole face. And we're still building up my new office. We moved it downstairs, and so it looks a little sparse right now. But we're going to be looking at code most of the time, so I think that's going to be plenty. The whole idea here is to build a project kind of from the ground up, and I don't have a script, I don't have a plan in some ways. I just want to show you sort of my process of how I go about building a project, and we're going to build something called the bookcase. It's going to use some data about books and libraries, and go ahead and build up a list of books that I've read, or that you've read. And this is going to be out in a project called Wilderstream on GitHub. So every week as I work on it, I'll go ahead and make sure that the latest version is there, and we'll see what happens. So glad to have you here. I'm going to switch over to where you can see my screen. And I'll try to keep this as big as possible so that everyone can read it, because Twitch steals a little bit of the screen real estate for me. But let's get started. So I'm going to start by just initting a Git repository, because of course, just to show you, completely empty directory. So I'm going to create a new Git repository, and oops, see, I've already screwed it up. And so we have a Git repository, so all this code can go in there, and I'm going to create a source directory. And I'm sorry that I'm not using Linux. I know some of you were like, this would be so much easier on Linux. Hopefully none of you are saying that. None of you were chatting with me yet, so feel free to pop in if you have questions. And what we want to do is start with a Vite project. I'm going to start with the Vue part of the project and build it up, and then we'll get into moving it into ASP.NET, and we'll build some APIs in ASP.NET that it communicates with, and we'll go from there. So the first thing is I have Vite installed. Actually, I don't. That's right. Vite's a little different there. Let's go to the thing that I'm going to end up using a lot today, which is Firefox. Now, I'm using Firefox instead of Chrome or some other browser just to qualify this, because I don't use it as my day-to-day browser. I don't have ad block and all other sorts of things in it. It's a clean browser for me to do development in. Whether you do that in Edge or something else, that's the main reason I'm doing this, and that's why it looks, you don't have any real bookmarks or anything like that. So if we look at, just search for vite.js.dev, and it's going to tell us that to get started, we're going to want to initialize an npm package with this Vite at latest. So let's do that. npm init Vite at latest. Now, I'd only use npm init to create the initial package for npm. I'd never used it with a package that could sort of walk me through it. So let's do this. Oops, npm init Vite at latest, and it's going to ask me some questions. It's going to ask me the project name, and I'm going to call it bookcase. And Vite supports a number of different frameworks. We're going to use Vue in this case. Vite is a different way, if you haven't used it before, a different way to develop these applications. It doesn't actually compile during development. It can compile during production, of course, into, with Webpack or whatever ends up being used. But this actually uses the module system inside of a browser. So for development, you need a fairly new browser for this to work, which I'm assuming most of us are working with. And you'll see what this looks like in a second. And I'm going to use TypeScript because I want to be one of the cool kids. So let's go into the bookcase. And we can see that it's a pretty standard Vue project at this point: index, source, public, tsconfig. And we'll see that there's this vite.config. So let's go ahead and just open this up in code where we're going to be doing most of our, especially the spa stuff. And first thing we'll need to do is actually install all of our things here. So I like coming over here and just saying run install. It'll get all the different pieces for us. And while it's installing, let's look at something. So this index.html will be sort of a temporary place. And what makes Vite different is it's using the script to the first script in our project. It's usually I'm not going to update you now. It's using a module type. And this module type is a new standard that's coming to allow you to not have to necessarily compile. Every time it sees an import, it'll download it. Though in practice, for a lot of our projects, we'll be compiling them, especially because we want them to work on older projects. So, so when we run this project, it'll just simply be there. And what we can see in the package.json, which is interesting, is all you need to do to run Vite is, or to run a dev build, is just say Vite. Now, there's some other ones for actually creating a build and doing preview, but Vite doesn't actually do the builds for us for production, but we'll get into that way later. You can see it's pretty simple. I'm just using Vue. I can add Vue routing and some other things as I need. So now that we have that, let's go ahead and run the dev. And this will just be running in the background the whole time. And we can see that it ran about 1.3 seconds because it's not compiling, right? So let's go back to Firefox and just add our site here. I love that you get free hosting on localhost. Oops, I'm not using it. Yes. Ooh, we've got the standard hello world sort of Vite project. Great. And so all our code's going to be here in the source assets. And so now that we've gotten both of those, we can see that this has all the changes we're necessarily going to need. We're not going to push them up to GitHub quite yet. Let's go ahead and let's clean up this project a little. So I'm going to get rid of the hello world component because I hate components. I don't hate components. I hate this particular component, hello world. And so I'm just going to start with a really blank project. So I'm going to get rid of some of this. And that should be good. So if you haven't done Vue before, we're obviously going to just be mounting the Vue.app, and it'll eventually live inside of this guy. So there isn't any magic here. It's just the same sort of view that you may have built before. Obviously, we're using TypeScript, so that might be a little new to you. And so I'm going to go ahead and build my first, I'm going to actually call it a view without the Vue, and I'm going to say bookcase.vue. So we're going to leverage these single file components quite a lot. So there was a question came in, is Vue my framework of choice? It depends a little on the project. I use Vue quite a lot. I use Angular somewhat when I'm building much larger sort of enterprise-y applications. Angular is also, I think, a good choice depending on what the skill set around your company is, because there are fewer Vue developers than there are enterprise. But if you're in a major market, San Francisco, Boston, Atlanta, Dallas, you'll be able to find people, of both. I don't use React really. JSX sort of gives me the heebie-jeebies. I probably shouldn't say that publicly, but it does. So I typically don't use it. But thanks for the question, Matt. So now that we're in our first view, let's just go ahead and create a template section. And that will be where our markup goes, and then our script section where our view goes. And I'm going to be using Composition API throughout all of this, so we can kind of see where that goes. I'm a big fan of the Composition API. I've done some talks on it lately. And so we'll see kind of how that works, especially in TypeScript, where I think some people are a little concerned about how well it works. And so let's just start with, let's say H1, my bookcase, right? I'm not doing anything really interesting yet. And if we go back here, refresh the project, of course it isn't building. Oh, I haven't included the bookcase. I always do this. So back in my app view, oh, by the way, get rid of this style as well. We're going to do our own styles in our own way in a minute. I'm going to need to add as components bookcase here. And let's see if it'll help us find it. Nope. Import bookcase from views. I'm going to rename it views bookcase. Because it doesn't find it because I've said view here for the name of the folder. And I want to views. We haven't broken it at all. And it doesn't like it. For default components, my bookcase. This is where it all goes sideways, and you're like, I have no idea what you're doing. Does the file exist? It should have rebuilt it. That's very weird. So I'm going to restart and make sure that it's actually a problem, not that I got caught up in a change I didn't save. That is odd. It's still looking for views. App, views, bookcase. Oh, I always forget this. In TypeScript, for some reason, it doesn't have the view as one of the sort of default objects here. So there are some things we could do to fix that, but for now I'm just going to use the .view. TypeScript doesn't seem to like me just leaving the end there. And we refresh it. Oh, I have to put, I don't only say I want to use it, but I want to actually, whoops. I get my bookcase. Woo! So before we get started, I want to be able to deal with the styling of this as well. And so let's go ahead and dig into that just a tiny bit. I'm going to use Tailwind. And so in order to use Tailwind, there's a couple of pieces. One is the adding Tailwind to the project, but it's also getting it inside of the Vue project as well. So if you haven't done Tailwind before, this will be interesting for you. And so this is pretty simple. We have our project, and so first thing we need to do is install these 3 projects: Tailwind latest, post CSS latest, which is how Tailwind does sort of its compilation, and then the auto prefixer. Oh, it's saying my audio is a little quiet. Let's see if I can bump up the volume. All new for me, so let's see what I could do to make that better. I don't have my pro mics in here yet, so that might be part of the problem. Performance mode, properties. I'll try to speak up. Is that any better, Rahan? It might just be that I'm starting to mumble, because it looks like I should be getting decent volume through here, and I can't figure out how to make it louder. Let me try one more thing before we go down here. You wanted to see a train wreck. Let's go to sound mixer for, oops, wrong thing. Sound settings, and there's my microphone, and it doesn't let me turn it up. Oh, that's great. Try one more thing. Just wants me to disable it. Okay. I will do my best to talk a little louder, and I do tend to mumble, so that is part of the problem with this live stream, is getting me to not mumble, but let's find out. So I'm going to go back here and I'm just going to open up a new console. And let's go ahead and add those. Why do you hate me right now? Those Tailwind requirements. Thank you, Matt. Mumblers unite indeed. Trying to do a little bit of my radio voice as well. You can tell that when I record my Pluralsight courses, I have to be very obvious about not mumbling. So my editor screams at me every time. She's like, "What did you say?" So it's all good. We've added those, and we also want to use an NPX here to. Oops, what you'll see here is to initialize Tailwind CSS, and this is actually going to initialize a Tailwind configuration file for us. If you haven't used NPX before, it's sort of you don't have to install something first to use it. We're going to be using Tailwind a little bit in here to get the piece we want. And so we now have a Tailwind Tailwind config file that has some different pieces in this that we can configure as we need. And we'll need this for a couple of things. We'll get to that in just a minute. The last piece we need to do is actually tell Vue that we want to use it. So let's first create a CSS file, because effectively what we're doing is we're telling Vue to compile the CSS for us. So let's go over, let's say, in assets and assets dot bookcase dot CSS. And if you haven't used Tailwind before, one of the interesting things here is that it creates a CSS file with all of the base components that are inside of Tailwind for you. And you can actually do something called purging, where you look through all your projects and only include the ones you're actually using. So it's a way to sort of build that up. But we'll see that I'm going to use the classes in Tailwind to be able to build up what our look and feel is pretty quickly. You can think of it as sort of like Bootstrap, but there aren't any components. It's more granular than something like Bootstrap would be. And in order to use these, we just need to go into our main.ts and import it. So import assets bookcase.css. Let's make sure it's getting it from the right place. And if we've done this right, go back to our project. And it says it doesn't exist again. Did I name it wrong? Where the heck did I name it? I swear I created it. Oh, there it is. Created it way in the wrong direction. Isn't it nice to see someone screw up over and over and again? And it's saying it's trying. What does it like now? Let's go over to the dev task and see what's complaining. That's old, that's old. Format error. Very confusing, right? Why it doesn't like that. Would that be better? Changing that? Nope. That doesn't like it. Let's make sure that I'm not screwing it up. Yeah. That should be it. I just named it wrong. Let's try this. Assets, bookcase. Now it says it liked it, right? Yeah. And we'll see our H1 has become this much smaller with a with a sans serif font, because that's one of the things it does, is it does a reset of all of the CSS entirely. And that's might be what you want, might not be what you want. And so one of the things we're going to do is, I don't like the reset. I want to be able to rely on, because right now if we did let's actually show you this instead of just explaining it. So here, if I did an H1, H2, subtitle, P, this is a paragraph, then over in our project here, they all look exactly the same. And that's what it's done with reset. It wants you to sort of pick what these look like. And I want to rely on some of the default sort of sizing. And so we can actually go into Tailwind. A lot of this is stuff that I end up having to do the first time and not again. Let's go ahead and search for Tailwind. Remove pre-flight. There we go. So this idea of pre-flight, and that is resetting all of these default margins and sizes, are what Tailwind likes to do. So, but luckily, if we go down to the bottom, it'll show us how to disable it. And that is just changing the configuration to turn it off. So we're going to turn off pre-flight. Going to compile it again. And for some reason, it's taking a long time. Yeah, unexpected. No, it didn't. Oh, there we go. So we're not getting the benefit of sort of the typographic stuff, but it's Tailwind is trying to purposely sort of give you a blank slate to work with. For our case, I don't want that pre-flight, so I'm going to deal with these separate sizes. And they're not actually that big. You can see this is actually the size. I was trying to make it big to sort of show you. So let's go ahead and let's go to our app view, and let's add some Tailwind pieces here to start to sort of structure this. And I'm going to do a .container, which, like Bootstrap, I'll put it in a container. Not terribly surprising. And this container, I'm also going to want to say, let's use one of the background colors just so you can see it. Background gray 800, let's say. See, it's kind of a dark gray. So there's the actual container, and we can see that at full size, because of the size of the browser, it's doing the responsive sizing here, but it's not centered on the page like I might want. So let's go ahead and add to here margin X auto. Now that's essentially going to do the same as margin auto 0. And the X here, in case you haven't dug into this before, the X here is specifically for the X-axis. So we could also have margin Y, margin ML for left, MT for top, etc. So they have different classes to allow you to do these specific things. Once we do this, we can now see it's nice and tiny. And if we make it smaller, it will always stay in that center, and eventually it'll get rid of the left and right margins because the container collapses when you get small. So we're getting some of those good pieces. And let's get rid of the gray, because of course we don't really want that. And I'm going to come over here to the index.html, because I just like the body to have its own color. So I'm going to say here gray, let's say about 300. And then our app view, we can just say background white. Woohoo! And there's a couple more here I'll show you. P is for padding, so I'm going to use 2. This isn't pixels. You can actually see when we do P2, it's going to give you a hint. This is actually about half a rem, or 8 pixels in size. Then that just gives us a little space. But I think we're mostly ready to actually do some development. And hopefully both of you are enjoying it. So we've got all that set up. Let's go into our bookcase, and what we'd like to do as a start is just get some data. So we have a website called openlibrary.org that unsurprisingly has an API for pulling in all these pieces of text and such. And so if we look at the API, of course, it's going to look for books in the API. It's down here at the bottom. Developers. And the web API has these notions of books, authors, subjects, etc. And we're just gonna use the subjects to get started. This allows you to search by a certain subject, and then it'll return the response with a list of books. And we're just gonna go ahead and bind them to it. So we could use fetch, but I actually like Axios in this case. So let's go ahead and go back to our other shell here and npm install Axios. Now the reason I like Axios, especially in the case of TypeScript, is because it can be type safe. And so now that we have Axios in here, let's go ahead and create a new component here for, let's call it HTTP. We'll call it our hook API, for lack of a better name. And all I'm going to do here is export a default function. So I could return an object or class even if you want to do that. And you'll notice that in my use of JavaScript and TypeScript, I'm going to actually turn off Copilot because it's trying to help me too much. You can always turn it back on later. That I tend to not use classes unless there's a really, really good reason, though I use interfaces quite a lot. In this case, I want it to be an async function because I'm going to use async instead of promises for most of my networking code. And I'm going to let it infer what the result is. So first I'm going to say result equals Axios, which of course I'll want it to bring in for me. Get, and then we're going to present it what the URL is here. So let's have it bring in the category. You see I'm using TypeScript to make sure that this is all type safe. Now we can just use the category here. And we're just going to wait. I think it's async if I remember right. Let's see what it tells me. Get. And what we're going to use here is a type information. And so I'm going to call this a type of response, which obviously we don't have yet. And that's one of the reasons I like the way that Axios works, is that it allows us to type the kind of object we're going to get back. But how are we going to type this response? It's expecting this to be some interface that matches the type. And so let's go back here and those have a lot of triple dots in it. Okay, let's go ahead and just execute this. Library. And so we can see we asked for love and it returned this giant piece of JSON back to our project, right? And so I'm going to go ahead and grab that raw data, the whole return, and I'm going to use JSON to ts.com, which is sort of not my little secret, but this is going to look at this type and infer interfaces for all the return types. We can see there's only a couple actually here. So I'm going to copy all of this and I'm going to create a new file called models. I'll call it books.ts. And what it's generated is our interfaces that match the JSON. So I'm going to get rid of the namespace because we don't actually need the namespace there in our particular case. You might in larger projects use it. So I have a couple of types in here we're going to use: author, availability, and most importantly, work. But the wrapper around it is this, what they call root object, because they don't have a name for the root object. So I'm going to call that, big surprise, the response. And so if we go back and look in our APIs, we should be able to import response from models books. And then this response ends up being the actual interface that we defined. And we can just return result.books. Not books, it is, I think I'd remember it was just works. There it is, works. Why doesn't it like that? Oh yeah, result.data.works. But we're not going to actually want to say if result.status equals 200, right? If we got a good status, let's go ahead and return that. Otherwise, we can just return undefined or something else, right? And what we can see, because this is TypeScript, is that the return type for this, they've already defined for us as either a promise full of work or an undefined object. So with that in place, let's go back to our bookcase view. And I'm going to start setting up some data that we're going to work with. So I'm going to call this const books. And I'm going to use ref here to say I want the books to be a reactive array that I can reset if I need to. And then return books. And I need to bring refs in from view, and you'll see it's all part of that view construct. And then let's leave this out here for a minute. Let's go ahead and bind to these books. Before book and books. And whenever we do a before, it wants to know some sort of key. So we're going to bind, that's what this colon here is for, bind the key to book.key, which I happen to remember is the property on the book that represents the key. And it will exist, I promise you. And then we're just going to do a div book.title, let's say, right? Now the reason this isn't typing in a way we want is that we're not typing the const books here, right? It just thinks it's a ref of whatever might be, which is why key and title don't know anything about it. So what we're going to do here is actually say that this is a ref of work. We're going to type it. So let's bring in these different things. So we're going to bring in ref as a type. Again, this is the TypeScript type, and then we're going to do the same for bringing in that model. And now it knows about it because this collection of books is a ref of those strongly typed keys in this case. And so here TypeScript is doing a lot of heavy lifting for us. We could also have said here array of work. Because it wants to autocomplete those when we're dealing with. And then the inference here would do the heavy lifting for us. Wait. Why doesn't it like that? Oh yeah. Tell it a blank array. And then this would be type to that as well, though you can see it's, instead of it being a books, it's actually saying this could be any of the items in here. So I'd like to use the ref instead. Whoops. So that TypeScript is going to help us to say whenever we add anything in here, it better be a collection of those books. So how are we going to load the books? Because right now, we come back here, you can see my bookcase, but there's no data in it, right? We're going to do this by calling on mounted. Actually, let's do this a different way. I'm going to create a function called load. And load is going to take the category, big surprise, and it's going to be async. Because we know that what we're calling here is going to be the method that does the work, right? Let's go ahead and tell that it needs to be a string. And we're just going to say books.value. And the books.value are, because this is a ref, we're changing the underlying object there. And we're going to load it from, what did I call that? I didn't call anything. Let's bring it in. Import call it book API or service or whatever you want to. I'm not too hung up on that part. HTTP, books API, async, book API dot oops, category. And that should be a wait, of course, because now you're seeing how all my editors always return the other piece. Now you can see that it's complaining because this could be work or undefined that is being returned here. So we can't actually just return this await. We're going to have to get the result is this, if result, then we can put the result in there. And there's probably a shortcut to doing that. The reason is this returns either the collection of work or undefined, and we can't assign undefined to books.value because we've already told it that it's going to be a collection of work. So we have to do that test in TypeScript to go, oh, if the result is undefined, obviously this won't fall through. And then the last piece we'll do is onMounted. And this is a method for Vue as well to say, when this component is mounted, do you want to run some code? So I'll use an arrow function here. And you're going to see a lot of async here. And we're just going to call await load. Let's do science. We'll start out with science fiction. I happen to know that's one of the names. Now, interestingly, onMounted and function load don't need to be returned because we're not binding to it. This is all about the work that's being done inside. Let's come back here. And let's find out what it hated. Evidently, it was something. Okay, it failed with a 404. So if we look at the network real quick, refresh, we'll see that 404, it didn't like that. Oh, and it's because we actually need to say, I think I'd be better at this by now, books.ts and is the category isn't an URL at all. We actually have to, let's build up our URL. So const URL is going to be https open library.org. I can't remember what we called it. Subjects. Subjects category .json. The .json is how they know what kind of data to return. So we need to have that in our URL as well. Let's throw the URL in there. And with luck, we're going to get a set of books. And you notice it's returned a small number rather than this huge number that you might want to call. And there are options here for dealing with the paging. because really what's being returned, refresh this and go down to the science fiction call. Let's open, oops. That is not what I wanted. If we look at the result for that science fiction call, we'll actually see the response has a collection of books as the total amount, and you can go ahead and use paging here if you want, because it's saying science fiction books, I have 15,000. And so later we'll implement, later on we'll go ahead and implement paging, but for now, let's go ahead and start building this up into something that might look good. We've got the data. Go ahead and get rid of everything except the one we're working on. And I'm going to go ahead and pin this. I always forget the shortcut for it, since we're going to be working in it. And so instead of this bookcase, let's go ahead and create a div. Let's create an image. And in this case, I'm going to bind to the image. And there is a format for the image that uses its ID. And I believe that's open library.org. Images, book.unique ID. I'll actually look at that in a second. .jpg, I think that's right. Alt equals book.title. Let's make sure we're binding that as well. Again, every time we use the quote in front of a attribute, we're saying allow yourself to do binding. And if you haven't done Vue before, like maybe some of you haven't, it's actually a shortcut to calling the v call that says vbind. And so we can just see the colons means there's some data binding syntax in here. It's not just a code in this case. It doesn't like the book title. Did I forget a quote someplace? I'll come back and figure out what that is, and then we'll just create a quick div for. Oh, that's what. I forget it's double. Should like that a lot better. Book.title. And here, if we go back and look at our model, you can see that the book title, key, subject, etc. has the idea of the authors. And so we're going to want to just grab the first author. We could make this a little prettier later by saying authors 0.name. And let's see how much it hates it. Sometimes the editor here gets confused in what we're talking about. Unexpected token. Let's see what happens here. JavaScript expression. Oh, yeah. Because we're doing string concatenation here, we actually need to do this in the JavaScript idea. Because it's not the binding syntax in here. I've been doing too much of nunchucks, which uses a little different syntax. So sorry about that. And I don't think unique ID is what it's called. I think it's key. So look at this, we're getting it doubled because, of course, we're getting the name and the object Huxley, but the image isn't the right image. So let's go back to our docs here. I say docs, but our developer and developer API. Fetching covers, but we don't need to fetch the covers because we can construct the covers just based on the, oh yeah, there we go. And so you'll notice that in the docs they say you can do small, medium, or large with different sizes of those images. And so we're going to construct this by using the ID here. I forgot about this format. So let's paste that in. Take that key and put it here with the S after it because we want it to be small. And the ID should work with using the key. So let's see what happens. It's missing. Expect this. There's our image. Why does it say ID works? Oh. Why is the key saying it work? Hold on. Let's see what I screwed up this time. Oh, there it is. Cut. Let's actually try this with, let's open a new tab. That's not right. Weird that it says it's a GIF image. And starting to mumble again. Let's go ahead and say that. I bet it's not the ID. Good reads, library thing. ISBN and see why that's still not returning us. Nope. Well, I'm going to cheat just a little bit. I have a version of this I was making for just to get myself comfortable with this. No, I do not want to do that. Let's look and see what I did here. Oh, I didn't get that far. Hold on. You hate when you have to cheat. I hate when you have to cheat. Is that the one from? Yeah, I just did a talk where I did this. So seriously, later. And got the image ID, book cover ID. That's exactly what it is. Maybe our cover ID is different. Let's try something else. Book cover ID. Oops, that's not our project. Let's make them medium since it looked like I needed to do it medium. And I'm going to get rid of the HTTP because that also might be a part of the issue. And there we go. We have our book covers. Woohoo! Right? So let's add a little magic here. Let's take our div that we're using as sort of the container there, and I'm going to use some Tailwind CSS and say border, let's say yellow, 600. I wonder what that sounds like. And if we go back, we can see we might have the borders here now. Nope, not yet. There we go. So we have our ugly borders. They're way, way too big. Let's go ahead and make this text large and text medium Let's do text center so that everything in here is centered for us. Still ugly. And the last thing we'll do is here in the class for the piece above it, we're going to introduce the flex container. And then we're going to say flex row. It doesn't want to do that for us. Hey, Paul. Yes, we are live as we can be. It's a very nerve-wracking thing to do, I got to tell you. But how interesting, the stream chat should be right over my head. I just noticed that in the stream. We should super fix that for next time. Oh, this is being done every time. That's right. Let's just go back here. So in our template, the reason I'm doing this, so I can explain, is that this row is being repeated every time. And so in fact, we don't need this extra div in here. Let's just do that. Get rid of the extra div just to clean that up a little. And so we need this flex container outside of the one that's repeated. And now we can see that we have it forever, right? Ooh, it's going outside the container because that's what we told it to do. Let's do a couple of things here in our container here. Let's say flex wrap, turn on wrapping, and let's make these all with W dash, let's say 96 wide enough, almost. Let's do 64. These are all arbitrary width that it's doing. Okay, 3 across, that's not too bad. Let's do 60 a real number. Yeah, we'll get 4 across. That'll be good. And I'm also going to do a margin of 2 and a padding of 2 so that we're giving ourselves a little more space. But of course, made the width not nice. So let's do 56, I think is a real number. And that's interesting. You'll see that they're not all the same width. Oh, it's because this width 50 isn't real. Let's do 48. I think is the one. Yeah. So in Tailwind, not all widths and heights are necessarily supported. There's a whole list you can see in 48 and I think 52 and then 60, 90, 72, whatever. So we can kind of get a sense of this. So we very quickly sort of gotten this very simple look to our application, right? And let's do a couple more things while we're here. Let's go hover, background, gray, let's say 30. Now this is a modifier to the way that Tailwind supports, so that when we go over it, we don't need to write any JavaScript to suddenly get these interesting pieces. And let's go ahead and do background, rounded in order to round our corners as well, right? So very quickly with this idea, gotten a decent look for this. But I do want to show you an interesting thing, because you might imagine as you're building your project with Tailwind, this starts to become really, really verbose. And for me, the magic around Tailwind is that, let's go over to our bookcase.css, because these are generated as the project is generated. And I'm going to come in here and actually going to create a component that I'll call book item, right? Just like I would write any other CSS. And this will be in between these elements. And these elements are in this order because, again, cascading rules are going to want you to know how this is. And I could go look up all of this, or I could do, once I've gotten the look and feel I want, is I can actually do @apply and then include all of that. And this, to me, is where it's sort of magical, is it allows me to prototype this quickly, but then my ultimate project here is just going to be book item, right? So that the markup is still clean, but once I've prototyped it to look the way I want, I can do apply, and if we've done it right, we should get the same look and feel, right? All still magically works, so it's trying to reload it for some reason. Did I throw an error? Nope. It just hated me for a second. So I hope that makes sense. We're right at about an hour. I'm going to be doing this once a week. I'll continue this project. I'm going to take what we have today. Let's actually do this. Go back to code, just so you can see this completely transparent. And let's go ahead and push this up to GitHub. And I'm going to create a public repository called WilderStream. And it does not like. Well, there shouldn't be a pull. Oh, there is a pull. Yeah. When I created it, it added a couple of files. Huh. So let's use the tried and true GitHub when the code one isn't working the way we want to. So I'm going to open up a repository, projects, Wilder, Stream. So there's these changes. Unborn head. I wonder what that means. Oh, it's because I haven't added these. Initial version from first stream. And then we can publish our branch. That was the problem. I had never checked in the code. And we'll probably want to create a README, and I'll actually do that after we do this. But if we go over to the repository, open up GitHub, should be a public repo. We have our code, source bookcase. And after this, I'll add a README to kind of describe what we're doing. We actually get a README here that was generated by the code. I'll probably delete soon. But go and fork and have fun and play with the code, and we'll see how it is. I'll fix that the chat isn't coming up in our stream. I'm not exactly sure why that isn't working, but I'll figure that out. And thanks for coming. If you've subscribed to the feed, you'll get notifications about next week, but it'll be the same time on Wednesdays every week. And well, I should be looking at the camera, not the thing I think is the camera. And I'm going to go to side by side so we can actually see each other. And so thanks for coming. Hope you've gotten a lot out of it. Feel free to add issues or questions in the chat here or in the GitHub repository, and we'll go from there. Thanks, everybody.